All right, welcome everybody. Today we're going to talk to David Hatcher Childress, and we're going to be screening questions from everybody. So let's welcome David.
Hi, guys. Hi,
Yay!
Jeff. Hi, Eric. I'm here with Joe.
Welcome to the show.
I think the man needs no introduction, so I think we can just get started. What do you guys want to start with today?
Is there anything you wanted to say, David?
Well, I've been enjoying Strange Tales Weekly. It's a great show, and I got a kick out of the D.B. Cooper episode and the one about who killed John Lennon. That was pretty interesting. And in fact, every time I see a copy of the Catcher in the Rye, I think of that movie Conspiracy Theory with Mel Gibson and Julia Roberts, and yeah, he's basically acting like the killer, Mark David Chapman, who killed Lennon. Who immediately as he shot Lennon, he just sat down on the sidewalk in New York and pulled out a copy of Catcher in the Rye and started reading it.
Have you read Catcher in the Rye?
Yeah, I read it in high school as a kid. A memorable book, sort of. I could think everybody back in the 60s and 70s, we all had to read Catcher in the Rye. I think.
Yeah, I had to read it, and I don't know if I cared for it that much the first time, but I had to read it a second time in art school because we had to do like a cover for it and things. And I actually got really into it then, which hopefully I can stay under control.
Yeah, so Eric's a little attracted to Catcher in the Rye.
But I did quite a bit like it.
Do you feel compelled to buy many copies, Eric?
I have one.
Sure. Well, there was a shocking scene in the movie when whenever he would get stressed or frustrated, he would have to go to a bookstore and buy a copy of Catcher in the Rye, and they knew that. So they're waiting for him to go into a bookstore in New York, and he buys a copy, and within a minute they're dropping from helicopters outside the bookstore to get him. So it shows you how they're watching you every minute, I guess. Got to watch out what you do.
I know, and then when that was like back in the day too, that was like in the 90s when they did that, and we didn't even know like they could track things like that.
Well, it was movies like that were showing that, and the Will Smith movie Enemy of the State with Gene Hackman. They were releasing secrets in those movies that people had no idea that they were able to do stuff like that.
Yeah, Enemy of the State's nuts from when it came out. You're like, no way.
We all could put our tinfoil hats back on and head down the street. Yeah.
But even like decades before that, with the Manchurian Candidate, they were putting that stuff out in movies.
Well, right, and when the Manchurian Candidate first came out, the character was so similar to Lee Harvey Oswald that they pulled the movie out of the theaters, and it became a sort of a suppressed movie. They say it wasn't really suppressed, but and then they made the remake.
You can't suppress it too much, right?
Yeah, I mean, certain movies are said to be suppressed. That movie, They Live.
My favorite.
Yeah, that movie was supposedly suppressed, although I saw it in a movie theater in San Jose. I was in Australia in the 90s, and people were saying, oh, that was a suppressed movie and that you couldn't get it on video and that kind of a thing. But you can get it on DVD. I've got it.
I think I do. Speaking of Australia, someone said, are you coming to Australia anytime soon, David?
Oh, maybe. I was just there a couple of years ago, and one of my best friends is the publisher of Nexus magazine out of Australia. And most Australians probably know that magazine, Nexus. We're the American office for it. But yeah, I'd like to get back down under, as they say. I'll tell you, when it comes to Indonesia and a lot of these Pacific islands around Australia, New Guinea and whatnot, there's a lot of strange stuff and megalithic things. You have Namadal, that city in Micronesia. There is so much out there, and I've always liked the Lost Island with the King Kong Island with all the ancient ruins and all that kind of stuff. So it's fun, and as you guys know, I love to travel, and it's great with Ancient Aliens being able to travel and go places with them. That's super.
So how like what is a good example of like an island along the lines of like Kong Island and something like that. Like there's things out there like that, right? Not with giant apes, obviously.
Oh, the dogs bark on Kong Island. Yeah. They, yeah, you know, I had a guy come to me at a conference recently. He was from Chicago, and he's been telling me that there was some documentary about a real Kong Island, and that it's some lost island around Indonesia, around India. That's where the Kong Island is supposed to be, and that it, and in fact that that other movie came out recently, Kong Island. And that too has this island shrouded in mist and cloud, and so people don't know it, but it's really there. And was this guy was telling me that this is real. There really is an island like this. It's still got prehistoric monsters and things like that running around. And so I've been intrigued whether there's, you know, a genuine King Kong Island out there that this is all really based on. But around Indonesia, you have that stuff, including these living dinosaurs. As just an example, the Komodo dragon, which is on only this small little island in Indonesia. But they think that those Komodo dragons are also still alive in New Guinea and other areas too. And really these giant lizards and also huge snakes and things, pterodactyls even, are still living in some of these just remote islands, but they're not islands way out in the middle of the Pacific like Easter Island or Hawaii. These are islands, you know, near to Australia, near to New Guinea and Indonesia. There's just so many islands there, and this is where a lot of the headhunters are running around. This is where the orangutans are. This is also where this Bigfoot type critter called the orang pendek lives, and he's a kind of a Bigfoot that's living in Sumatra and Borneo and places like that. When I was a kid, my parents would always tell us not to act like the wild men of Borneo, which as 12-year-olds, that's how we acted. So, you know, the other word expression that we have in English that comes from that area is to run amok.
Oh. And
amok is a Malaysian Borneo word, and it means to go crazy, to run amok. But that's a word that they use.
So they have a reputation out there, huh?
Sounds like it.
And that's what happens on these Kong Islands. The critters run amok, and the people run around screaming. I think that's what happens.
So you mentioned Bigfoot. You want to talk a little bit about Bigfoot being one of your newer books?
Yeah. Bigfoot is my new book, Bigfoot Nation. And in fact, for Christmas, my brother gave me this emergency Bigfoot call right here. And just in case you need it, you can press one of these buttons and you get a Bigfoot howl. Or you get a Bigfoot snort. Or you get a roar. It's different from the howl. Or you get the Bigfoot groan. That's my favorite.
Ooh.
So you got to carry one of these with you when you go hunting for Bigfoot. That's what I figured.
Yeah, they don't have that on Google Translate yet, so it's probably handy.
Yeah, right. You can't translate Bigfoot yet.
You know, there's an interesting story in my book about a older Native American woman living up in the Hoopa Reservation, way up in northern California near the Oregon border. And it's very rainy and wet and heavy forest there. And this woman said this big Bigfoot came up to her front door. She lived in a remote forested area. And that she stood there at her door just looking at Bigfoot. And she was an older lady and she wasn't afraid. And she tried to talk to him. And she asked him questions, tried to get him to talk. But he would not say anything, she said. He just sat there and just looked at her. But she wasn't afraid, she said. But he eventually just walked away. But without trying to communicate. That's what she said.
So when you say eventually, like what kind of time frame are we talking?
Yeah, I think maybe a couple of minutes, and it was at night. And she had like a little picket fence in front of her doorway. So they were maybe 10, 15 feet apart or something like that. But she was very friendly to the Bigfoot. And there are other stories like this too, particularly of older women who are widows or something, and they own like usually it's typically an orchard. There's a story in Illinois of a woman who owns an apple orchard. There's a similar one in Georgia of a woman who owns a peach orchard. And they live by themselves, and Bigfoot comes and at that time of year takes apples and peaches from this orchard, and the woman would watch him do it. And so they developed a relationship. The Bigfoot wasn't afraid of the woman. She wasn't afraid of the Bigfoot. And the Bigfoot knew that the woman was watching him take apples from her orchard. And what happened then, according to the woman, and this has happened in several stories, the Bigfoot then began leaving her presents, some food, like a dead rabbit, rabbit and had been neck broken. And so the Bigfoot started leaving her presents in exchange for the apples or peaches that he was taking.
Bigfoots are not known for good present giving, are they? Dead rabbits.
You got to wonder what Bigfoot eats in the winter time in some of these places, like in Illinois or, up in northern Michigan where it's cold up there and it freezes over. You would think that Bigfoot hibernates a little bit like bears, kind of. And also I've been told by Bigfoot researchers that I've interviewed that Bigfoot sleeps in dens and caves, much like bears do. Well, even they make their own little dens, like on river banks or on steep gullies and stuff like that. That's what I'm told. Bigfoot does make these strange whistling sounds and chattering, kind of childlike, little chattering and whistling. People have heard that. Sort of like a child crying a little bit. Do you hear that noise?
Yeah, I think that's Eric's cat. It sounds like a Bigfoot.
It sounds like Bigfoot there, yeah.
I can reread this question from Jamie. It's been rewrote. Let's see. It's back to the solar frequency. Okay, so the book clearly shows the solar frequency warp drive, or warp motor gravity drive, the negative energy plates, spherical RF core, and inertia dampening systems, an ancient astronaut holding the SF adjustment shafts. That's not even clearer than it was before.
Wow, that's fascinating. Well, yeah, I mean the anti-gravity drives of these craft. I mean, that's what they must be using, is anti-gravity, gravity control, gravity manipulation, artificial gravity. That's what you're doing. You're powering up your craft, and you control gravity. Pretty soon, you're zipping off in one direction or another, and hopefully, you have able to jump to hyperspace at some point. But there's a lot of books about different space drives and anti-gravity, and I'm fascinated by those. And there's a lot more material out there that I think than people realize about anti-gravity space drives, even stuff that NASA has put out. There is a lot. And that's part of the whole UFO enigma, really, is that UFOs themselves are not jets, they're not rockets, they're basically electric craft that are being powered up. And in fact, whenever I have the chance to meet someone who claims they've been in the ships with the extraterrestrials, my first question to them, I usually have two questions. One is, what's it like up there in the command bridge? Is it like Star Trek or whatever? Is that how it looks? And I also ask them, did you go to the bathroom or did you eat anything while you were on these ships? And it's funny, whenever I ask them these questions, they often get kind of tripped up. No one's ever asked them these things before. And then they have to say, oh, well, I never went to the bathroom while I was on the ship, or, oh, I didn't get to go onto the bridge, where they controlled it. Mm. But that is what there's very few photos and descriptions of what the control panels, what it looks like inside one of these craft. And here your question is talking about, the power source. It's interesting in Star Trek that the power source there and the drive was, their warp drive, was dilithium crystals. Well, lithium is an element. When you have a quartz crystal that has lithium in it, That's an amethyst.
Mm.
Yeah, when you look, if you go to a gem shop or something and you buy amethyst quartz crystals, they're quartz, but it's a beautiful purple color.
Yes.
So that, I mean, so in Star Trek, when they talk about their power source being dilithium crystals, they're basically saying amethysts. So yeah, I mean, you have your giant, quartz crystal that's purple, and somehow that is powering these spaceships. I mean, how amazing is that?
So we have Davy Boy in the chat, going back to Bigfoot, asking if the Bigfoot had any indication that he maybe understood her.
What I've gotten from a number of books, and there are several that claim this, that people are in contact with Bigfoot, but it's basically a psychic connection. Yeah, and so that's what people are claiming, so that they're in telepathic communication, psychic communication with Bigfoot. Bigfoot doesn't have some vocabulary like we do, and if we sit there talking and chattering to him, I think it doesn't mean much. But again, our facial expressions, the way we say things, and even, again, some kind of psychic thing that's coming out, that's how we're going to communicate with Bigfoot. Much the same way we're able to communicate with dogs and cats and other animals and stuff. I mean, you look at parrots, particularly African gray parrots, that are very good at learning phrases, and they can sort of talk. But yeah, they're just mimicking things they hear all the time. And they say this about Bigfoot, that he is a mimicker and he tries to mimic people. That's a big story about Yetis that they tell in Nepal and Tibet, is that the Yeti wants to imitate people and do what we do. And in fact, one of the famous Yeti stories in Nepal is how Yetis were attacking and harassing this one village, and they wanted to get rid of the red Yetis. So their story was that what they did was because they knew the Yetis were watching them, they had a big party outside in the village, and they were drinking this Chong beer, and they all drank, and then they pretended to take their big kukri knives and swords, machete type things, and they pretended to fight each other and hack each other, but they weren't really doing it. It was just pretend. And then they all went back into their houses in the village. And what happened then, this is the legend, the Yetis came in and drank some of the Chong, and because they're trying to mimic humans, they then grabbed the swords and machetes and kukris that had been left on the ground, picked them up, and attacked and killed each other.
Oh!
They got rid of the Yetis by making them act out what they had done, but they did it in real. They were just pretending to kill each other, these Sherpas. So that's a strange story about Yetis.
That is a strange tale.
What was that? Cut out.
Are we back?
Yeah, we had a glitch there.
Yeah.
Well, somebody's asking, do you know where Atlantis is?
Ooh.
Boy, that's a common question, and one that's people have brought up all the time. Atlantis has been put all over the world, from small islands in the Mediterranean to actually Crete or Cyprus, even to Algeria and areas of the Sahara. France and England have been talked about as Atlantis, Cuba, the Caribbean, Mexico, even North America has been said to be Atlantis. And people have put Atlantis in places like Indonesia and spots like that. North Atlantic, around the Azores, of course, the Canary Islands. Part of the problem with Atlantis is that the story of Atlantis, as a famous one, is that there was a catastrophe. Also, Atlantis was an island. It's typically said, although a lot of people ignore that part, and so what people are looking for, they say, well, let's find an island and let's find a catastrophe, then maybe we'll find Atlantis. But that's part of the problem, is that there's so many catastrophes and so many islands and massive destruction and flood type scenarios that you can go almost anywhere in the world and find legends of that. So it's very easy to find legends of catastrophes, floods, destruction, but to place them all as Atlantis is one thing. There's been now that interesting talk about this, what they call the Eye of Africa. Have you heard about that? It's a kind of a meteor strike in northern Mauritania. And it's a very interesting photo that you can see, these satellite photos, but it makes a concentric crater. And that's one of the things they talk about Atlantis being, having concentric circles. So that's one of the more recent ideas out there, that this Eye of Africa is actually Atlantis. But it's out in the middle of the desert, of the Sahara Desert, that place.
I think the Azores is pretty compelling.
Yeah, in my book on lost cities of Atlantis, Europe, and the Mediterranean, I largely say that it's probably around the Azores. Geologists say that 12,000 years ago or so, ocean levels were 300 feet lower than they are today. And that was during the last ice age. So during the last ice age, there were these huge ice caps at the North Pole and even around Chicago and the Great Lakes, and in theory, a big ice cap at the South Pole too. But if you were to lower ocean levels by 300 feet, that would turn areas around the Azores into a mini continent, just like Atlantis. It would turn the Bahamas also into a mini continent. It would make the Caribbean and those areas also more of a larger, bigger island instead of a bunch of small ones. And if you went out into the Pacific, you'd have more of the same. Areas around Tahiti, the Tuamotus, even Hawaii and Tonga and places like that, you would suddenly have mini continents, not these island groups that we have today.
How long have people been looking for Atlantis?
Well, Atlantis is in the Bible. The oldest books in the world are about Atlantis. They say that more books have been written about Atlantis than any other subject, except for the Bible. So anytime you're talking about the antediluvian world, the worlds before our own, civilization that's prior to, say, 10,000 BC, you're really talking about Atlantis. And, we might as well give it a name. And that name is Atlantis, really. That civilization that's pre-10,000 years ago or so. But we get the story really from a Greek, we get it from Plato, the Greek philosopher, who tells the story of his uncle Solon, who went to Egypt. And the priests in Egypt tell Solon, who's a Greek statesman, they tell him, "You Greeks don't even know your own history. Greece is a much older country than you even know." And then they tell him the story of Atlantis. And that's how we get the story of Atlantis. Egyptian priests telling Solon this long story about Atlantis and how Atlantis had wars with ancient Greece and the Mediterranean, that there were lots of elephants in Atlantis. There's all kinds of things. Graham Hancock suggested in one of his books that Antarctica was Atlantis. And a lot of people thought that might be right. I personally don't think Antarctica is Atlantis. I think it's too far away from the Mediterranean.
That's a little far from Greece, huh?
Yeah, and I don't think there were a bunch of elephants there. I think that Atlantis was much closer to the Mediterranean, like the Azores. You also have in France and England and Ireland, you have all these legends of High Brazil, of the lost land of Is, and that's in France and Brittany, the lost land of Lyonesse, that's in Cornwall in England. So in all these Western European countries, you also have legends of a Western land that's gone now and is sunken beneath the ocean. And that's, of course, the story of Atlantis, as we know. And in fact, the Atlantic Ocean is basically named after Atlantis. And I found one time when I was in the Basque area of northern Spain and southern France there, the Basque language is so strange with all these X and awful sounds. And it's very similar to the Nahuatl language of the Aztecs, where you get these Quetzalcoatl, Otl, Atlanta, Exakikakakal sounds. And when you listen to Basque people speak, or you listen to Nahuatl in Mexico, very similar languages. They sound almost the same. And they're strange languages too. They don't think there's any language that's related to Basque. It's like a unique language, they say. Although, and this is perhaps the language from Atlantis, ultimately. But with the Basque language.
Are you going to make an appearance on The Curse of Oak Island?
The Curse of Oak Island. Well, I love Oak Island, and I've been to Nova Scotia. It'd be great to go there. Yeah, and you know what? That's a very popular show on the History Channel. It's more popular in the United States than Ancient Aliens.
What?
The Mystery of Oak Island. Yeah.
Yeah, really?
Yeah, in the United States, Ancient Aliens is more popular in international markets, but in the United States market, and I suppose Canada, the Mystery of Oak Island outranks Ancient Aliens, actually.
Wow, I couldn't even name somebody on Curse of Oak Island.
There are some two brothers, really, who are, trying to find the treasure. And I've watched the show a few times, but not that much. But, I mean, it's an intriguing show, but not much happens, really, every episode, I don't think.
Have you studied Oak Island?
I've been to Oak Island, yeah, back in the 80s, and I wrote about it in my book on lost cities of North and Central America. And I do think that the Knights Templar and Henry Sinclair and these Scottish Masons and Templars, yeah, they went to Oak Island. They built a castle there. The Zeno brothers were helping them go to Oak Island. And this was Henry Sinclair of Rosslyn Chapel. A lot of Americans don't know this, but the Sinclair family is very important in Masonic and Templar lore. And the Sinclairs are big in Canada more than in the US. It's a Scottish name. But one of the early presidents of America was a Sinclair. Before George Washington, we had 10 presidents. We say that George Washington was the first president, but there were actually 10 acting presidents during the war while Washington was a general. And one of those was a Sinclair and he's from that Rosslyn Chapel family. He's from this Oak Island family, and he was Earl of the Orkneys. He was mysteriously murdered in the early 14th century there in the Orkneys, where they think that Vatican assassins went there to assassinate him, and they lured him out of his castle in all of his armor and everything, but then they killed him once he left the castle. And that was his fatal mistake, going outside of his castle to see what rabble and fighting was going on, and it was all to attract him so they could kill him.
And the Sinclairs were part of the Da Vinci Code story. Okay,
yeah, right. And see, Rosslyn Chapel which is near Edinburgh, and part of my family is Scottish a number of times. But Rosslyn Chapel was there's a castle there too. And it's said that the Ark of the Covenant in some lore was kept there for a while and then moved to Oak Island. That's one of the Templar Ark of the Covenant stories.
Yes.
But it's fascinating. And even today, because of the Da Vinci Code, Rosslyn Chapel is a big tourist site now. And the two sites in England that you want to see in Britain, I should say, associated with the Da Vinci Code is the Temple, which is in London, and it's called the Temple. It's this round building in the old city of London. It's right where the Old Bailey is. It's where the first courts and lawyers were created. It's this special Knights Templar building and church that's right there in the heart of London. And in fact, it has its own subway station, as they call it, the Underground in England, and it's called Temple Station. And that station is closed on weekends. But in one of the recent James Bond movies, James Bond meets with M, his superior, and he meets with her in this abandoned and unused underground station. And he says to her, he says, I thought that there was something like this existed. It's a station on the underground in London that's not an official station. And that's probably near Temple. It seems like in that area, they have the royal family and the British intelligence has a special station that's there that only they can go to. But anyway, that's also associated with then Rosslyn Chapel and the Sinclair family near Edinburgh. So that's all that. Also there in Edinburgh, you have the Stone of Scone, which is supposedly taken from the Temple of Jerusalem, and all the kings of England they're coronated in a throne that has this special stone in it. And that stone is in Edinburgh Castle, there in Edinburgh. Or they call it the Stone of Destiny too. And it's this very important stone from Solomon's Temple and features heavily into Masonic and Templar lore. In fact, in England, it's very famous, the Stone of Scone, or the Stone of Destiny. And Scottish nationalists claim that they have it in a secret place, and that what's at the Edinburgh Castle isn't the real Stone of Scone; it's a fake. So there you go.
That happens with the Ark of the Covenant too, right? Yeah. They have supposedly it's in that where's that place at where they have that guard that stands out in front of it?
Yeah, that's in Aksum in Ethiopia. Yeah, there's a special church there, and
I never heard this. Sorry.
There's a special church in Aksum, and Ethiopians believe that the Ark of the Covenant is kept there. But in Ethiopia, there are thousands of copies of the Ark of the Covenant, and that one is probably a copy too. So that is one of those things where these things are perhaps these famous relics, like the Stone of Destiny, Stone of Scone, the Ark of the Covenant, that there are copies of them made, and then they're put in different churches. A lot of these old church relics are, well, there's the Shroud of Turin, but you have certain churches that claim they have pieces of the original cross that Jesus was crucified on, a piece of wood or something. And you wonder how authentic a lot of those relics are, but the churches that have them, they're always very important, those things. The one in the Ark of the Covenant in Aksum, it's at the Church of Mary, Mother Mary. No one is allowed to go into that church, and it has one custodian at a time, who's a very old priest. And right before he dies, he nominates another priest to take his place. So there's only one person, and that custodian is not allowed to ever leave that church. It's got a fence around it. It's a small church. You can see it from a distance, a few hundred yards. There's guards to keep you from actually approaching the fence. Other priests are allowed to go and talk to that priest who guards the. And I saw it when I was there, and I took some photos. But there's not much you can really see, just the church itself and then the big fence around it.
So is it a tourist attraction of sorts?
Yeah, I would say it is a tourist attraction. And it's right near the giant obelisks and the megaliths at Aksum. The largest obelisk that was ever erected was erected at Aksum. It's bigger than any Egyptian obelisk. And it fell at some point in prehistory and broke into about 5 giant pieces. Even the pieces of this obelisk are massive. But that obelisk weighed 600 to 800,000 pounds. It was huge. So there are still a few obelisks still standing, some smaller ones, and some other large buildings there too. And in fact, that obelisk, the big one, as it came down and crashed down onto this other big building, and it's lying now on top of it, it's a sort of dolmen with a huge, massive capstone that also weighs hundreds of tons. And the lore of Aksum is that underneath that rock, which they can't get under, and it's just massive, and then this fallen obelisk is on top of it, they believe that there's a huge anti-gravity machine there that was for lifting and levitating all these huge blocks, lifting the obelisks, and even probably has cutting heads for cutting the stone and stuff like that. That's
really handy to get to, huh?
Yeah, so I mean, it's some kind of Vimana super machine that does it all, and levitates stones, cuts them, all that kind of stuff. So it's like when you think of the H blocks at Pumapunku or something, and the idea of some giant craft just landing, and then the quarrying machines are just taking these granite blocks and cutting them into these H blocks and then spewing them out, and then they're able to fit them together into these walls. And something like that was going on at Aksum in Ethiopia too.
How does a story like that come about, like originate? Like something hidden underneath a place?
Well, the way that story originates is that the people there, and when you see those things, the giant walls and huge blocks of stone weighing hundreds of tons, modern construction crews can't build those things. And so the same thing happened to the Spanish when they got to Peru and Bolivia. They looked at these giant walls and they thought the devil must have made them, or giants, because they're so large. And the Spanish, even though they were capable of making some pretty nice buildings and castles and stuff, they wouldn't build with blocks of stone that were the size of a train car or something like that. And that's how big some of these things are. So say in Aksum, the people realize, they say, we don't know how this was built. We don't know how our ancestors raised up these obelisks. We don't know how they did it, but they did. And here it is. We're living right here. But we can't do this now. We don't have the cranes. We don't have the anti-gravity that would lift these things. So therefore, these legends, shall we say, come about. And that is that there's some kind of magical device that's technical, like the Ark of the Covenant, that can do these things, because we can't do it. But these magical machines from ancient times, they can do it. And we must have one here somewhere. It must be all of these rocks. That's like what they think. And actually, they say that the Ark of the Covenant is also doing this. They believe that the Ark of the Covenant had the power to raise these giant obelisks too. But they have to be quarried. They have to be moved into position and then raised up. Egyptologists and archaeologists have not figured out how the Egyptians or the Ethiopians or other people were able to quarry these massive obelisks, move them. Just moving them out of the quarry is difficult enough. And then you got to get them onto a boat or something, take them down the Nile, move them to some other place where they're going to stand it up. They can't do it today. If you in Cairo or in Ethiopia and Egypt, they don't have what it takes to erect these really big obelisks. A lot of the obelisks were stolen from Egypt and taken to Rome. The Romans were able to move some obelisks, and they built special ships, cargo ships, to haul them to Italy. But the Romans had block and tackle. They would build huge cages. They had technology that allegedly the Peruvians didn't have, or the Egyptians. And this is part of the problem. This is where ancient aliens that doing things that just difficult to us, things that we wouldn't do today, and building in a manner that we wouldn't do today either. We can't really explain it. That's why they had to have anti-gravity, levitation, means of doing things. And this is, what I point out in so many of my books. It had to be easy for them to do these things, not really difficult.
Right.
So if you're going to go, let's say the giant stones at Baalbek that weigh over 1,000 tons, even just something weighing 20 tons is super heavy. You've got things that weigh 1,000 tons. Why would people be trying to build and move blocks of stone like that? It can't be because they're just trying to do things in the most difficult way they can think of. It has to be easy for them. And that's what baffles archaeologists today, is that we presume that they're primitive and they don't have the technology that we have, but we can't understand why they would want to build with such giant blocks, which would seemingly be difficult to move, to stack up on top of each other. We wouldn't build like that today with such giant blocks. So that, these are all part of the mysteries, and it's what you see in South America is even more interesting, because supposedly The Incas and other civilizations in South America didn't know about the wheel, didn't know about riding. I mean, they did not know about block and tackle and things like that. They may have known about levers and rollers or something, but they're presumed to be very primitive, yet they're doing things that's extremely sophisticated and in ways that we can't explain.
What about giants? These have been giants.
Well, giant, you know, right. And that's why they thought early in the Bible when Moses and the Israelites come to the promised land, which is Israel, and they're in Jordan, and they send spies out to Jericho and things like that. And the spies come back, but they're seeing in Lebanon and other areas these giant buildings like Baalbek. And they report back to Moses and they said, man, these guys are giants. They're the Anakim, they're the Nephilim and all that. And, you know, to them, they're thinking these guys must be 12, 15 feet tall, stuff like that. And people were taller in ancient times. People and all animals and plants, we've all been getting smaller in the last, say, million years or so. Everything on this planet's getting smaller, really, not bigger. People have been getting smaller too. Cro-Magnon man was taller than us with a bigger brain. The idea that people were more like 7, 8 feet tall in the past, that was more standard. There were pygmies and miniature people too. What has taken really the average height of people down is mankind's favorite sport, and that's warfare. So warfare is like a football game or a rugby game. You're putting the big guys up front, and they get killed. So warfare basically takes the average height of people down several inches. The Napoleonic Wars took the average height of the French people down by several inches. The French aren't really known to be very tall today, and a lot of that's because all the tall people got killed in the Napoleonic Wars. But this is kind of what's happened really throughout history, is that the giants, the really tall people have been killed in wars. And they're thought to, and that's one of the stories of the Bible where David kills Goliath. Okay, Goliath is the giant symbol warrior of the Philistines. So when they have to have a one-on-one battle, they choose Goliath. He's the biggest of all of them. But when the much smaller David goes into battle with him, David uses his slingshot, hits him in the forehead with a big stone and kills him. And didn't matter how tall he was. He was not, he wasn't invulnerable to a projectile from a slingshot, That's what, in a similar way too, with that, crossbows are what really made armor, unusable. Once they invented the crossbow, and exactly when the crossbow was invented, that made wearing armor totally useless, because a crossbow was an armor-piercing weapon. It could pierce the armor that these knights and stuff were wearing. So once they had the crossbow, they stopped wearing armor anymore because it wouldn't protect them. And back to giants, yeah, it's the big guys all get killed, and it's the smaller, shorter people who live on. So, and we see that with animals too. In the Pleistocene era, just say 20,000 years ago, here in North America, all the animals were bigger. We had giant cave bears, dire wolves, giant elk, giant sloths, giant woolly rhinos running around. I mean, everything was bigger. I mean, about twice as big as what it is today.
So do you think the idea of giants, there wasn't like Jack and the Beanstalk giants running around? It was just people were just taller.
Right, and some people were taller. Certain nations are tall. The Dutch and the Norwegians are very tall. Polynesians are supposedly the tallest race. Tongans and Samoans, Hawaiians, they are big. They're tall. If you get on a plane to Tonga or Samoa, most of the people, including the women, will be over 6 feet tall. Most of them will be 6'4", 6'6", something like that. They're big. Dutch people are extremely tall too. Your average Dutch person is well over 6 feet. And so, with better nutrition, people are getting taller again. But historically, just things have been getting smaller. But yeah, you could have whole tribes of giants, and like the Patagonian giants and things like that, or say islands full of giants like Tonga or Samoa. One of the interesting stories in Hawaii is the Menehune, who are these little people. So you have these hobbit type people and pygmies running around. They say that the country with the smallest people in the world is Guatemala. And that's because of the Mayans. The Mayans in Guatemala are very, very short, and the women particularly. Guatemala has the shortest women in the world, and many of the women, particularly women, but men too, are barely 5 feet tall or well under that. And if you go into the highlands of Guatemala, yeah, you're often surrounded by whole villages of people who are barely 5 feet tall. So you see a lot of that. And it's interesting. I mean, the tallest person who was ever recorded was actually a Robert Wadlow from Southern Illinois. But he was a pituitary giant in the sense that he had a glandular problem. And he could hardly stand up on his own legs and things. A true giant is someone who is really physically shaped, as you know, in every way, to be much larger, bigger bones. I mean, they're just bigger and they're stronger. I mean, we look at a basketball court. And they're athletes too. I mean, that's what I mean. Robert Wadlow had to wear iron braces in order to walk. But yeah, other people who are 8 feet tall or something, they don't need that. They're perfectly normal athletically. But I'll tell you, stories of Bigfoot. Some stories of Bigfoot claim that Bigfoot is 12 to 15 feet tall that they meet. Meeting a Bigfoot who's 15 feet tall, I mean, that is something. Yeah, and meeting anyone, when you just meet someone who's 8 feet tall, you're blown away by how tall they are, and again, it's like how tall you are compared to them. So, but yeah, there are giants. I think not like the giants in the beanstalk, but whole races of people who were much bigger than us. Yeah.
Do you have any advice for people who want to become an archaeologist or really into archaeology but don't have money to go to college or something? What should they do?
Well, I'm into archaeology, and I went to college, but I did not get a degree in archaeology. So, I'm a archaeological writer. I write on archaeology, but I don't have a degree. So, I mean, I fortunately have been able to travel, and I do travel a lot, and that's been more of my education, is traveling and going places. It doesn't cost as much money as you might think to go to these places.
Really?
A credit card, and buy an airline ticket and get there. You don't have to stay in hotels that are $100 a night. There's lots of cheaper hotels than that. I mean, you need maybe $2,000 or something, but it's not that hard. Getting to these places is really the hard step, just to make that first big step out of the country. Going to Mexico is easy. By the way, the pyramids at Teotihuacan in Mexico City are very, very impressive.
Oh,
and they're just a day's drive or so from American border, also in northern Mexico. But otherwise, it is that tearing yourself away from your home, getting away from your dogs and your cats, getting an airline ticket, going to South America, going to Asia, going to Egypt or Europe, wherever you're going. It's making that first step, and that's a big step to take. But once you've started traveling, it becomes much easier to do, and pretty soon you find you need a passport too. But next thing you know, you're off to all these intriguing places that you've always wanted to see. And I hope you will go there and see all those places. And the more places you see, the more places you want to see. It becomes a real fever where you see all these cool places, and you meet other travelers who've coming from here or coming from there, and they tell you, "Oh man, I've just been here and I just saw this. It was so cool." And you're thinking, "Yeah, man, I want to see that too." And a lot of times you go to countries and you find things that you never even heard of, and that are only largely known, in the country. I remember when my wife and I went to Myanmar, Burma, a couple of years ago, and there's this weird place in southern Burma, this golden rock that's precariously perched on this other boulder, and these Buddhist monks take care of it, and there's a temple there, and it's some kind of miracle that this rock doesn't, fall off this other rock. And so pilgrims come there and they worship it, and they climb this mountain to see this rock. And it's pretty amazing. I mean, we went and did it. It was something to do. But I'd never heard of this thing until I went there. And so there's the whole, our world is just so fascinating. There's so many interesting places to see and people to meet. It'll take you a lifetime to see all these things for sure.
Awesome.
Let's go. I'm pumped. Let's go. Let's get passports.
Well, I'm off to Peru with a World Explorers Club group just in February 13th. We still have a few places open on that if you want to. We fly to Lima, and then we go to Cusco, Machu Picchu, and Lake Titicaca. Peru is a wonderful place too. I mean, there's certain countries that are just so jam-packed with mystery and magic and interesting things. Peru is one of them. I never get tired of going to Peru. There's just so much to do there. I like the people of Peru. It's a fun place. It's an interesting place. And Tiwanaku and Pumapunku are right near there. They're in Bolivia, actually. It was a little bit different, but it's great. South America is very much a land of adventure. If you want to be Indiana Jones, I think that's the place to go. Yeah. There's so many places to see. And it's difficult. Some places are difficult to travel in. Africa, I would say, is difficult to travel in a little bit. It can be expensive. A lot of Pacific islands are hard to get to, and they can get expensive too, going to some of these remote islands and just getting there. But you just kind of got to get going and get started.
So coming back home to America, I'd like to hear you talk about the Grand Canyon cave with the Egyptian artifacts.
That has the guard.
Yeah, and I write about that too in one of my later books called The Lost World of Cam. And that Cam, C-H-A-M, Cam, the Cam people, Kampa. In 1909, when that story appeared in the Phoenix Gazette about the Smithsonian doing these excavations, and an explorer named Kincaid finding these caves. What the story basically was talking about, all of these statues and objects, swords, even mummies that were in the caves. And they were trying to place them. And they said, well, they're very Egyptian, but they also called them Tibetan at the same time. And that's where this Cam comes in. The actual Egyptian name of Egypt is Cam or Kem or Kemet. So the word Cam or Cam is an Egyptian word and means actually Egypt. But you have these people also in Indonesia and Vietnam and Thailand, Cambodia and Indonesia. They were these Shivite Egyptian Hindus. And so much of their statuary was very Egyptian-like, but also very Tibetan-like too. And that's what confused, I think, the early explorers in the Grand Canyon. They saw these things, they could tell it was some, strange Oriental culture, part Egyptian, but also parts Hindu, Buddhist, and Shivite. Shivites are Hindus who worship Shiva. And other Hindus, normal Hindus a male would shave his head and wear what's called a tika, which is a little like Hare Krishnas. They have a little ponytail on the back of their head. Shivites don't do that. They don't shave their head. They grow all their hair in as long as they can, and then they tie it in a big bun on top of their head. They're called Shivites. And Shiva has a third eye in his forehead. He carries a trident. He has hair like that too. Shiva lives in Tibet and in the Himalayas, but he's like an ocean Atlantis type god. So these guys were going out from India and Thailand, Cambodia. The word Cambodia comes from this same word too, Cam, the Cam people. Angkor Wat, all these things. You have also the Kampa or Cam. These people are more or less extinct, except they're still in Cambodia, really, and a few parts of Vietnam. But they went into the Pacific, and they were Buddhist Hindu, Egyptian seafarers, and they were megalith builders. They were out looking for gold and metals. They apparently had amazing powers. They could levitate stones, like at Nan Madol in the Pacific. That's a place. It's got 250 million tons of basalt that's apparently been levitated into these artificial islands and walls there at Nan Madol. I mean, they can't explain how that was built, but apparently these same Cam people did it, or this was ancient aliens at that point. But that is apparently what is in my mind, that's what's in the Grand Canyon, is artifacts from these people. And they are, in a sense, Egyptian artifacts, but they're also Shivite, Buddhist, Hindu artifacts too. And I'm sure that some of those statues were statues of Shiva that were in there. They've apparently, most of those things have been removed, taken back to Washington, D.C., where they're suppressed ultimately.
They're put in a warehouse and we'll never see it.
Well, that's right. And I always like to point out that scene at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where the Indiana Jones is saying, you know, hey, where's the Ark? I want to see it. You know, where is it? And they say, don't worry, top men are working on it, top men. And then the last scene is they're putting it in a warehouse where no one's going to see it. And, you know, I've concluded that this is what happens. This is very true. Bones of giants and other unusual skeletons. They suppress those. A lot of these elongated heads that are in some museums, they suppress them. It's literally, certain archaeologists in the United States will go to museums around the world, in Central America and South America and other places, and they'll tell them to remove these things from display. Take them off display. Because they're too weird. They're just too strange. A lot of elongated heads and stuff. And they don't want normal people seeing them in these just museums. Like, wow, you know, who's that weirdo with the long head? Well, now they don't have to explain it. You can't see it anymore. Malta was famous for this. They found all of these elongated skulls in Malta. But none, and we have photos of them, but none are on display. That the museum in Malta will not put them out. They're too strange. I mean, it's kind of strange exactly why that would be. So I have seen even museums in Mexico, one at Comacalco, where I have photos of displays of some of these elongated heads and weird things and other strange pottery. And I go back 10 years later, it's gone. I mean, and you wonder why, because it was so cool and weird and strange, but the people in the museum were like, oh no, we don't want this in our museum. It's too strange. So there you go.
Crazy.
Awesome.
Yeah, the guy who wrote George Orwell, one of his famous quotes is, he who controls the past controls the future. So by controlling the past and making, even just manipulating our own history of the past and where we come from and what there was, they're manipulating the past to control us now and control the future. And in a way that means removing these traces of giants and evidence of giants. One of the reasons to do that is that towards the end of the 1800s, as this new science was coming on and different schools of science, and they wanted, the scientists wanted to battle the religious nuts and the people who just believed everything that was in the Bible or something. And so certain things like giants were things they wanted to suppress, because if they went out and found some giant, skeleton of a giant, some weird giant who was 9 feet tall in a mound or something, then the Bible thumpers would all go, yeah, you mean giants like in the Bible. This means the Bible's true and everything in the Bible is right. And the scientists were all trying to go, no, the Bible's not right, and don't believe everything in the Bible. And no, there aren't giants, And so therefore you have a lot of the people who are more fundamentalist Christians, their whole goal in life is, I've got to prove the Bible is true because I believe in the Bible. So what do they want to do? They want to go find Noah's Ark. Well, if I go to find Noah's Ark up on Mount Ararat, that will prove to everybody that the Bible's true, and we can believe what's in the Bible, and that's all fine. I mean, and so your average person is sort of torn between these two extremes. One is the extreme of science, saying, "Oh no, don't believe what's in the Bible or all these old texts. Giants. Those are just stories. The Ark of the Covenant, what Moses did, all these weird things. They're just weird stories. Don't give them any real credence." While on the other, but yet, we want to give them some credence, so there must be something going on there. But the other extreme is more the religious extreme, where it's like you have to believe everything in the Bible. The Bible's the Word of God, all this kind of thing. Everything in the Bible's exactly true. And and so I think your average person, can see there's a middle way there, and you can believe some things in the Bible, and I certainly do, but you can still see that there's a lot of legend and myth that's associated, and not everything in the Bible has to be true. That's for sure. And much of the Bible contradicts itself. So it's that kind of thing. But that is why the Smithsonian, and I think a lot of museums and things, that they've tried to suppress things. They don't want us thinking too much about the past as it relates to religion and things like that. So that's my explanation why they suppress things on the Bible. The reason they suppress things like Egyptians coming to America or other things like that is one of the weird dogmas of America, of North America, is that American Indians basically lived in the Stone Age. When Europeans came here, this is what we're taught. American Indians were hunting buffalo and making arrowheads and spears and stuff. But they didn't have swords. They didn't have metal helmets. They didn't have metallurgy and foundries. They weren't making metal daggers or nails, metal artifacts. And so therefore the Plains Indians did live like that. They were very primitive, and so they were very easily conquered by the Europeans who came in. But see, that's a myth too, that if you go down to Mexico, they had all these metals. They had swords. They had helmets. They were living in the Stone Age. They had copper tools and all kinds of metals, metal daggers and spearheads. They had all that. And so, but in North America, we're trying to paint the early Americans, the original ones here, as not having the same civilization we had. And so this is what happens when they start finding statues and things in the Grand Canyon, or artifacts that are Roman artifacts, and this can be in North or South America. The powers that be want to suppress that evidence. They want history to just begin with Columbus and the very first Europeans coming to America. They don't want this complicated ancient history that involves all kinds of people from all over the world, different languages, even Egyptians coming to America, Romans, Phoenicians, Hindus. Right now, the Smithsonian has finally come out and said that the Olmecs came from ancient China and are related to Shang Chinese glyphs. The Smithsonian itself is saying that. But what's happening is the main other universities aren't going along with that. So the Smithsonian has finally said, yes, ancient Chinese explorers and seafarers crossed the Pacific in boats, came to Mexico, and brought Shang Dynasty script. That script that's in Mexico is coming from China. And that's what the Smithsonian has. They are officially saying that. But what's the problem is the Smithsonian can't get other universities to get on board with this. And it's unscientific. What these universities are saying is that oceans are barriers. You can't just get into a boat, go somewhere. No, there's a big ocean there that's going to stop you from going places. Oceans are these giant barriers. But that's completely false. That's utterly unscientific. Oceans are highways, not barriers. Oceans that's the easy way to go somewhere. Well, flying is easier, but yeah, to get on a boat and go to. So if you want to go from China to Mexico, the these old school archaeologists are saying, oh, well, you can't get in a boat and go from China to Mexico. You got to walk there. You have to walk through Alaska and down through Canada and then down through America. And then finally you'll get to Mexico. That's how you get to Mexico from China. But that's crazy. That's unscientific. And the Smithsonian has finally acknowledged that and said, yeah, no, people are crossing oceans in boats, just like the Vikings did, just like the Polynesians, just like the Malaysians did to Madagascar. Oceans are highways, not barriers.
I can still picture that graphic from my elementary school geography book with the arrows coming down up through Russia and down through.
Walking across the land bridge there. And
you know, you don't even need that land bridge. It freezes over in the winter. You can walk it in the winter. You can walk between Alaska and Russia every year. You can do that. There's nothing to stop you. That's what happened with the Apaches too. There was an Mongolian invasion of North America around the same time of Genghis Khan, around 1200 AD. And all of these Mongols swept from Siberia into Alaska and Canada, and then came down through the Midwest and decimated the mound builders. They sieged the mound builder cities in Wisconsin and Illinois and Missouri and Ohio and killed and ate everybody. And then they went west to New Mexico, out through Arkansas, Colorado, New Mexico, and came into Arizona. And today the Apaches range really from New Mexico and Arizona down into southern Texas. But they speak a Siberian language that's not related to other Native American languages. I mean, it's very clearly a Siberian language. And the whole thing of the teepee and the travois, the whole thing, that's a Siberian thing, really, of building teepees. And if you go to Mongolia or Siberia, they call them yurts there.
Oh, yeah, yurts.
Yurts, yeah. And some are circular, but some are just like a teepee. They're exactly like our teepees. In Siberia, they used reindeer as animals to haul, and probably reindeer were used originally to bring some of those guys to Alaska. But by the time they were coming down into the Midwest, they had no animals with them. Dogs would be the only animal that they had. Dogs are good eating too, you know. Look at your cat at.
Yeah, I guess we're gonna wrap it up.
Well, it's been really fun talking to you guys. You're a strange bunch. You've got plenty of strangeness. I gotta hand it to you.
Thank you.
Really
This
appreciate
is
your time
amazing.
today.
Yeah, thank you for spending time with us today. We really appreciate it.
It's been fun, and I love Strange Tales Weekly. It's my favorite weekly show.
Thank you.
Yeah, and don't forget to watch the AUP channel, that Adventures Unlimited Press channel. You can navigate there and check out our magazine too, World Explorer. It's a strange magazine.
We'll put the strange links below in the description.
Strange link, yeah. Hit your strange links, and you're off.
Awesome.
Good.
Yes.
Well, thanks everybody.
Yeah,
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
You too.
Everybody stay strange.
Stay strange.